On October 25, 1976, the Forosov family, headed by Ural Forosov, a renowned professor of constitutional law at the University of Claremont in sunny California, experienced a defining moment: the birth of their first child, a baby girl named Kristin. As my colleagues recounted, the Forosovs were over the moon with happiness, as the arrival of the little one was a wonderful addition to their successful life. Thanks to their high positions and status in society, they could provide their children with everything necessary for a comfortable existence and development. Soon, the family welcomed two more boys, Brent and Pierce, who became Kristin's younger brothers. However, the parents paid special attention to the upbringing and education of their eldest daughter. From an early age, Constance, the girl's mother, took it upon herself to unlock Kristin's potential. She enrolled her in ballet and modeling classes, hoping that these fields would open up a brilliant future for the child. And it must be said, not for nothing, as Kristin showed remarkable talent in both areas. Often, parents project their own ambitions and unrealized dreams onto their children. Sometimes this can lead to negative consequences, as the child doesn't always share the adult's vision of their life path. But for now, Kristin enthusiastically immersed herself in the world of dance and the catwalk. It seemed that a dizzying career full of bright prospects awaited her. Nothing foreshadowed trouble until one day a tragedy occurred that forever changed the girl's fate. In my opinion, the parents should have listened more to Kristin's own desires instead of imposing their vision of the future on her. However, who knew that an innocent childhood hobby would turn into such a dramatic twist in the life of this family? Just yesterday, Kristin was a rising ballet star, and today her future in this field is under threat. My colleagues managed to find out that dancing became not just a hobby or a whim of her parents for the girl, but a true calling. She lived and breathed ballet, despite her young age. Kristin was, without a doubt, an incredibly talented child. Her plasticity, grace, and artistry captivated the audience during each performance. The girl easily outshone professional dancers, demonstrating remarkable potential. Critics had already begun to compare her with leading ballerinas of our time, and producers predicted a brilliant career on the most prestigious stages of the world. These predictions seemed quite realistic, as Kristin was developing at an incredible pace. If everything had continued like this, she would have undoubtedly become a prima ballerina in one of the leading theaters in Europe or Russia. But life sometimes throws unexpected surprises, and they are not always pleasant. One such unpleasant surprise was a serious injury that Kristin received during training. A torn ligament in the ankle, it would seem a trifle because a child's body usually regenerates quickly. But the doctors were relentless. The damage was so significant that it would be impossible to return to the previous form. For the girl, this meant the collapse of all her dreams and hopes. As a detective, I perfectly understand that such situations can break anyone, not to mention a young, fragile girl. Losing the meaning of life at such an age is a real tragedy. But Kristin had to come to terms with the idea that her stellar ballet career had ended before it even began. But what happened next shocked me. Kristin, who only yesterday was full of hopes and dreams, now found herself at the bottom of despair. Her heart was broken, and her soul was drowning in an abyss of sorrow. Instead of enjoying her youth and planning for the future, the girl plunged into depression. And this is not surprising because she lost not just her favorite thing, but the meaning of life. But instead of fighting her demons, Kristin chose the easiest path and escape from reality. Before she even had time to finish school properly, she fell into the grip of alcohol and drugs. For her parents, this came as a real shock. They had no idea that their talented daughter could stoop to such a thing. Suddenly, it turned out that Kristin was not only using prohibited substances, but also spending the money her parents gave her for pocket expenses on them. The family began to have constant quarrels and conflicts. The tension grew every day until the situation got out of control. It got to the point where the police had to be called to calm the passions. It's hard to even imagine what the Forosovs had to go through in those days.
Just yesterday, they were proud of their daughter and made plans for her brilliant future. And today they found themselves at the epicenter of a family drama. However, despite the pain and disappointment, they did not turn away from Kristin. The parents continued to support her, hoping that these were only temporary difficulties. And indeed, after a few months, the situation began to stabilize gradually. Kristin was still suffering from depression and cravings for psychoactive substances, but at least she was no longer throwing tantrums or running away from home. It seemed that the worst was over, and now the family could overcome this crisis together. In my opinion, this case clearly demonstrates how fragile the human psyche can be. It is worth only one detail to fail, and the whole structure begins to fall apart before our eyes. And if it weren't for the support of loved ones, who knows how it would have ended for Kristin. But new trials awaited her ahead, which were to finally temper her character. But not everything is so good, because what was next struck me. 1994 became a year of new beginnings and hopes for Kristin. She finally pulled herself together and decided to start life from scratch. The girl realized that she could not endlessly feel sorry for herself and cry over a lost dream. If a ballet career no longer shines for her, then she can always try to realize herself in another field. Kristin decides to enter university to obtain higher education in a new profession. For her, this was a bold step, because not so long ago, she did not see the point in life at all. But despite all her efforts, the ghosts of the past continue to haunt the girl. Her mental health, although improved compared to previous years, still remained fragile. In 1995, a relapse occurred that almost cost Kristin her life. Depression returned with renewed vigor, clouding the mind and paralyzing the will. The girl again found herself on the edge of the abyss, from where, it seemed, there was no return. She was ready to take a fatal step in order to get rid of the suffering that was poisoning her existence once and for all. But fate decreed otherwise. The suicide attempt was unsuccessful, and Kristin was saved at the last moment. This incident became a kind of point of no return, after which the girl realized that she could no longer exist like this. She had to change something in her life in order not to go crazy completely. That's when Kristin makes a desperate decision to temporarily leave her family and go on a trip to another country. She gets on a plane and flies to the city of Texona, on the border of Mexico and the USA. Perhaps a change of scenery and new impressions will help her reboot her consciousness and find new meanings. In my opinion, this step was quite risky, given Kristin's unstable mental state. After all, it is unknown how she will behave in a foreign country, far from family and friends. But sometimes it is such radical decisions that help people get out of the deepest depressive states. I had to hold my breath from what happened next. Sometimes life throws us unexpected surprises in the most unexpected places. So Kristin, who went to Mexico in search of peace of mind, met her destiny there. Greg de Villers, a 22-year-old guy traveling with his brothers, accidentally ended up in the same city as her. Their paths crossed, and a spark immediately flashed between the young people. Over the next few days, Kristin and Greg spent time together, enjoying each other's company. It seemed that they had known each other for an eternity, so harmoniously and effortlessly they communicated. It was true love at first sight, which grew and strengthened with every minute. Even when it was time to return home, the lovers did not want to part and agreed to meet again. Barely setting foot on American soil, Kristin and Greg began to actively build their relationship. They constantly met, spent every free minute together, and soon realized that they could not live without each other. That's when Kristin agreed to move in with Greg. At that time, the young man was renting an apartment with his brother and a friend. But love is able to overcome any inconvenience, so Kristin agreed to such cohabitation without hesitation. But before deciding on this step, she decided to be as frank as possible with her chosen one. The girl told him about her mental health problems, about prolonged depression, and about the struggle with addiction, which was still ongoing. Greg was not at all frightened by this confession. He knew perfectly well that the abuse of psychoactive substances could destroy not only Kristin's health, but also their relationship. But the guy was firmly determined to support his beloved in this difficult struggle. His feelings were so strong and sincere that he was ready to make any sacrifices for the sake of their common future. From the point of view of a detective, I can only approve of Greg's position. Unfortunately, in my practice, I have often encountered cases where lovers turned away from each other at the first difficulties. And here is a young guy who has barely graduated from university, showing remarkable maturity and wisdom. As often happens, the black streak in Kristin's life was not limited to just one problem. The girl had barely begun to settle in a new place when things began to disappear in Greg's apartment. Today it's some kind of jewelry, tomorrow it's cash, and then checks. Of course, everyone immediately began to suspect the new inhabitant, because before her appearance, such incidents did not happen. But Kristin categorically denied her involvement in these thefts. She assured that she didn't even think about anything like that. The girl sincerely believed that she had managed to convince her roommates of her innocence when suddenly the incredible happened: the missing items were found in her purse. This incident came as a real shock to all the residents of the apartment. One of Greg's brothers even decided to move out, as he could no longer trust Kristin.
He was convinced that the girl had deceived them by pretending to be an innocent sheep, but in fact, she simply took advantage of their gullibility. But Greg was in no hurry to condemn his beloved. He knew perfectly well that addiction can push a person to the worst deeds. Theft, deception, manipulation, all these are just side effects of the disease that Kristin was trying to fight. And although the fact of her guilt was obvious, Greg was not going to turn away from the girl. In my opinion, this situation clearly demonstrates the true essence of love. After all, it would have been so easy for Greg to wave his hand at a troubled girl and find himself another life partner. However, he decided not to give up and continue to take care of Kristin, helping her fight addiction. This required a lot of patience, wisdom, and strength of mind because a long and thorny path awaited them. Everything would be fine, but after the following events, I had to sit down. They say that true love can work miracles, and the story of Kristin and Greg is a vivid confirmation of this. Despite all the hardships and trials, the young man never once turned away from his chosen one. Day after day, week after week, he patiently helped her overcome the consequences of addiction, believing that the day would come when she would finally be able to return to a full life. And that day has come. Thanks to Greg's unconditional support and care, Kristin managed to achieve what seemed impossible just a few months ago: complete detoxification of the body. It was an incredible victory because the girl had to go through real hell, fighting her own demons. But her path to recovery did not end there. Kristin understood that she had to radically change her life in order to never return to the past again. She decides to enter the University of San Diego, where she begins to study diligently. The girl quickly becomes one of the best students in the course, demonstrating remarkable abilities and diligence. As a result, in 1998, Kristin received a diploma with honors. This achievement opens up new horizons for her, and the girl gets a job as a toxicologist at the Bureau of Forensic Medicine. Finally, she found her calling and can start life from scratch. It would seem that here it is long-awaited happiness. A stable job, a bright future ahead, and most importantly, a beloved man nearby. Greg, who went through all the trials with Kristin, decides to propose to her. He gets down on one knee and asks for her hand, dreaming of forever uniting his life with this amazing woman. From the point of view of a person who has seen a lot of broken destinies, I can only applaud Kristin and Greg. They prove that true feelings can overcome any difficulties. But will this be enough for a long and happy life? Rumor has it that on the eve of the wedding, the bride began to doubt her decision. Anxiety did not leave me, and not only me. Kristin, without hesitation, agrees to marry Greg, the man who was there for her during the most difficult moments of her life. It would seem that here it is the long-awaited happiness that one can only dream of. But fate decided to play a cruel joke on the young couple. A few weeks before the wedding, Kristin begins to be enveloped in doubts. The girl is seized by anxiety. She begins to panic, thinking about future married life. What if this decision turns out to be a mistake? Is she ready to take on such a responsibility? These and many other questions do not give Kristin peace day or night. In the end, she decides to turn to her parents for advice. Fortunately, loved ones find the right words to support their daughter. They assure her that doubts before the wedding are an absolutely normal phenomenon. Every bride experiences something similar because marriage is a serious step that changes your whole life. The main thing is to listen to your heart and not be afraid of the future. These wise instructions help Kristin calm down and believe in herself. And so, on June 5, 1999, the newlyweds finally step on the wedding towel. The ceremony is wonderful, the bride and groom are shining with happiness, and the guests sincerely rejoice for them. It seems that all fears and doubts are left behind, and only a bright and carefree life awaits the couple ahead. But as often happens, the euphoria from the wedding quickly passes, and grey weekdays come to replace it. A few months after the wedding, Kristin again begins to feel some strange anxiety. She confesses to her friends that she feels unhappy and depressed in her relationship with her husband. And then a new employee appears at work, Dr. Michael Robertson. This attractive Australian immediately attracts Kristin's attention. She begins to spend more and more time with him, discussing work issues. At least, this is how it looks from the outside. But my colleagues say that in fact, some special chemistry arose between these two. And very soon, the working relationship grew into something more. Well, from the point of view of an experienced detective, I can say that such situations happen more often than we would like. Sometimes people just can't resist temptation, especially when not everything is going well in their personal life. But in this case, the consequences of this reckless step will be simply fatal. The flirting between Kristin and Michael became so frank and undisguised that even the most naive and trusting colleagues began to suspect something. They constantly whispered, exchanged meaningful glances, and at the first opportunity remained alone. Some even saw this couple secluded in Michael's office during their lunch break, and although there was no direct evidence of a secret romance, all these little things added up to a rather eloquent picture. And indeed, the relationship between Kristin and Michael went far beyond business. They became so carried away with each other that they completely forgot about their marital duties. It seemed that they did not care about the feelings of their partners who were waiting for them at home. Love turned out to be stronger than common sense and a sense of duty. But the worst was yet to come. Having plunged headlong into this passionate romance, Kristin broke down again. All of Greg's efforts were in vain. His wife returned to her worst demon, drugs. And this time the temptation was greater than ever, because now she had direct access to prohibited substances right at her workplace. The forensic department stored various narcotic drugs seized from crime scenes. One of Kristin's direct duties was the accounting and control of these substances. That is, in fact, she could freely take whatever she wanted without fear of being exposed, and the girl took full advantage of this opportunity. From the point of view of professional ethics, such abuse of official position is unacceptable and even criminal. Any law enforcement officer is obliged to immediately report such an incident to their superiors. But Michael decided otherwise. Having learned about his beloved's problems, he not only did not condemn her, but also undertook to cover up Kristin's antics. In my opinion, this was a fatal step, and this untied her hands completely. Now her decline was only a matter of time, and nothing could stop this process. While Kristin and Michael enjoyed their secret romance, Greg, as always, remained in the dark. The poor guy sincerely believed in his wife's fidelity, not even suspecting that something was going on behind his back. He continued to swear eternal love to her, not noticing the obvious signs of betrayal. But in the end, the truth came out. One day, Greg accidentally came across a love letter written by Michael to Kristin. This scrap of paper, hidden in a woman's purse, became a real bomb that shattered their marriage to smithereens. The man was shocked and enraged at the same time. How could she do this after everything he had done for her? But what struck Greg the most was not even the marital infidelity. Much worse was the fact that because of her relationship with Michael, Kristin started using drugs again. All the efforts that Greg had made to pull her out of this swamp turned out to be in vain. His wife simply spat in his soul, destroying the last hope for a happy family life. Of course, Greg was not going to remain silent. In a fit of anger and indignation, he threatened to expose everything to Kristin's superiors. And this was not an empty threat. The man perfectly understood that for such antics, his wife and her lover could not only be fired from work, but also brought to criminal responsibility. However, that day the quarrel ended in nothing. The couple was simply tired of figuring out their relationship and decided to postpone this conversation until the morning. The next working day, Greg did not show up for work. His absence caused concern among the management, because the man had always been distinguished by punctuality and responsibility. An attempt to call him did not yield any results. The phone was hopelessly silent. At the same time, Kristin, as if nothing had happened, went to work. She even found time to chat with Michael, although she tried not to draw too much attention to it. Meanwhile, a real horror was waiting for her at home. Returning home for a lunch break, Kristin found her husband unconscious in bed. Greg was barely breathing, his body covered in cold sweat. The woman panicked and rushed to call an ambulance. The dispatcher on the other end of the line instructed her on how to properly perform artificial respiration and heart massage, but all attempts to bring her husband back to consciousness were in vain. When the medics arrived at the scene, a chilling picture opened up to their eyes: Greg's lifeless body lying on the bed, strewn with red rose petals. And next to it lay Kristin's open diary, open to the page where she mused about how she would leave her husband for a new life. These details immediately led the medics to certain reflections. At the hospital, Greg was officially declared dead. A shocked Kristin, through tears, told the police about her terrible day, not forgetting to mention the rose petals. They say it was a symbol of her and Greg's breakup. To be honest, it sounded too melodramatic, and Kristin's own behavior raised many questions. Did she really hope that her husband would simply let her go to another? However, the autopsy showed that Greg's death was due to an overdose of psychotropic substances, and this raised even more questions because the man had always been an opponent of drugs. Is all this just a tragic suicide or someone's insidious plan? But here is the brother of the deceased, Jerome, absolutely convinced that Kristin is behind all this. and it seems that he is determined to achieve justice at all costs and expose the deceitful daughter-in-law. At least, the man immediately began to act. He regularly called Kristin, recording all the conversations, and at the same time pressured the police, demanding a thorough investigation of the case. Jerem's persistence, the brother of the deceased Greg, was not in vain. Under his pressure, the investigators still returned to the investigation of the case, even though the initial version of suicide seemed quite plausible. And then one of the detectives notices an interesting detail: Greg's remains were sent for autopsy to the same department of forensic medicine where Kristin worked. It would seem that there is nothing strange because it is a standard procedure, but the person responsible for the autopsy turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson, the lover of the suspect. And this forced the investigation to look at this whole story from a different angle. Digging deeper, the detectives found out that just a few hours before her husband's death, Kristin had managed not only to give consent for the donation of his organs, but also to prepare everything necessary for the cremation of the body. Such efficiency in the actions of the grieving widow was difficult to write off as a coincidence, and the examination conducted by Robertson raised many questions. To avoid any doubts and manipulations, it was decided to conduct repeated toxicological tests in an independent laboratory in Los Angeles, and the results were shocking. They differed significantly from those obtained in San Diego. Yes, traces of psychoactive substances were indeed found in Greg's body, but one of the drugs exceeded the lethal dose by as much as 7 times. That is, this substance was fatally dangerous for a person in such an amount. Of course, a natural question immediately arises: why was a private laboratory able to detect this drug, and the forensic experts of San Diego did not? Did they simply not notice the obvious? Although, on the other hand, there is an explanation, because we are talking about a very rare and dangerous drug, tests for which are usually not prescribed in routine cases. But this does not remove other issues. As Kristin claims, her husband was alive and relatively healthy during the day, although he looked somewhat sluggish. So why did he drop dead in the evening from such a crazy dose of the drug? And why was fluid found in his lungs, indicating repeated loss of consciousness? How could a person in such a state lay out rose petals on the bed and then calmly go to sleep? Is a drug addict with such experience would keep at home any vial of his medicines? Even more questions arose after the interrogation of the ambulance crew. It turns out that the medics arrived at the call just 3 minutes after Kristin's call, and when they entered the bedroom, the woman for some reason was not near her husband's body, but in a completely different room. Paramedics also noted that Kristin was unlikely to have performed heart massage, at least for the last few minutes before their arrival, because there was no characteristic redness from chest compression on Greg's chest. The investigators also carefully studied the recording of the conversation between Kristin and the ambulance dispatcher on that fatal night, and they came to the conclusion that the tape does not contain sounds that usually accompany resuscitation procedures. Did the widow not try at all to save her dying husband, or did she simply lack the skill to simulate the provision of assistance? However, this is not the only thing that the detectives found out. Thanks to the testimony of one of the police officers who was at the scene and then accompanied the body to the hospital, it became known that on that night Kristin met with some man. They even hugged in front of the cop, and this mysterious guest turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson. So a search in the offices of both lovers was only a matter of time, and although Michael admitted that he covered up petty thefts of drugs by Kristin, which she used, he allegedly had nothing to do with the disappearance of other substances from the warehouse. However, trusting the words of a person who has just been fired for an official crime would be at least naive. One thing can be said for sure: the investigation of this case is far from over. Ahead, the investigators have a lot of work to do, because the evidence pointing to Kristin's involvement in her husband's death continues to accumulate, and an avalanche of compromising evidence is about to bury her head. The least of which are love messages found on the suspect's work computers, and most importantly, correspondence in which lovers directly discuss the same drug that became fatal for Greg. And as if that were not enough, there is information that Kristin and Michael at one time attended a special presentation dedicated to the properties and dangers of this substance. Did they just take an interest in the topic for work purposes? Or maybe they were thinking about something more sinister. No less strange are Kristin's actions on the day of Greg's death. When buying roses, she paid in cash for some reason, as if she wanted to hide this purchase. But the system still recorded the goods she selected, because the woman naively used her loyalty card. And what do we see? A red rose turned out to be a mandatory attribute of the posthumous installation. Coincidence? I do not think so.
Meanwhile, Michael Robertson quietly left the S, going to look after his sick mother in Australia. A convenient legend, isn't it? Especially considering that in his homeland, American laws will not reach him. However, even from there, he will not be able to escape justice. After all, 7 months later, on June 25, 2001, Kristin Frost was officially charged with the murder of her husband. Despite all her assurances of innocence and appeals to the version of suicide, the jury found the woman guilty. And in my opinion, absolutely rightly, there was too much incontrovertible evidence collected against her. So the judge passed the only correct sentence, life imprisonment without the right to early release. Does this mean that the case is closed? Not at all. After all, there is one more person involved, Michael Robertson, who continues to hide abroad. However, sooner or later they will get him too. I would even say that it's only a matter of time because an arrest warrant for the doctor has already been issued. American cops will just have to show a little more ingenuity and persistence to drag this scum to justice. A woman and her newborn daughter disappeared unexpectedly, and their search gripped the entire local community. The tragic conclusion of this story shocked everyone, as no one could have imagined who was responsible for this horrific crime. Hey friends, Detective Brooks here. 33-year-old Heidi Browse had worked as a waitress at a restaurant in Butte, Texas, a town with a population of about 7,000 people. At the same time, she was studying at veterinary school, aspiring to become a veterinarian. Recently, she got engaged to her boyfriend, Shane Carey, with whom she had been together for 10 years. Their relationship began at work, where they quickly fell in love with each other. The couple had a son, 5-year-old Silas, who was born while they were still living in Louisiana. Heidi had a best friend, Majan Fieramuska, whom she met at a children's camp when she was 11 years old. They instantly clicked and maintained their friendship for 20 years. Majan, who was also 33 years old, worked as a wedding planner. In early 2019, when Heidi announced that she was pregnant with her second child, Majan also revealed that she was expecting. This delighted Heidi, who dreamed of sharing all the joys and troubles of pregnancy and child rearing with her friend. The friends started spending a lot of time together, planning every aspect of their pregnancies and upcoming births. They bought clothes for the newborns, cribs, diapers, attended prenatal classes, and went to the pool together. Majan was even present at the births of both of Heidi's children, including little Margot in November 2019. Their relationship was so close that they dreamed their daughters would also become best friends. On December 12, 2019, at 7:30 a.m., Heidi dropped her son Silas off at school. However, at 2 p.m., the school called her fiancé Shane, informing him that Heidi had not shown up to pick Silas up. This was very unusual, as she had never been late before. Shane immediately went to the school, picked up his son, and returned home, hoping to find Heidi and their daughter there. He assumed that Heidi might have been tired and fallen asleep with the baby, forgetting to pick up their son from school. But at home, he was met with an unpleasant surprise: the house was empty. Shane tried to calm himself by thinking that Heidi and the baby might be out for a walk and had lost track of time. He tried calling his beloved, but she did not answer. Then he called her best friend Majan, who was also about to give birth. However, Majan said she had not seen Heidi that day. This seemed strange, as they communicated and met daily. Shane began searching the house for clues, and seeing that all the baby's things were still at home, including clothes, diapers, food, as well as Heidi's wallet and car keys, he realized something was wrong. She never went out with the baby without these things. Worried, Shane waited a little longer, and then around 7 p.m. called 911 and reported Heidi and the newborn's disappearance. The man could not find a seat and literally started to cry. It was as if he felt in his heart that something bad had happened. He reassured himself that maybe she was just held up somewhere. But why didn't she even take her wallet? People can't just disappear, you know? He was right. His premonitions came true, and he could not even imagine the calamity that was to befall him and his child, who was already an orphan. The police quickly arrived and began searching for Heidi and her newborn daughter. A thorough examination of the house revealed no signs of forced entry, intrusion, or struggle. Everything was neatly arranged. Initially, the police suspected Shane, as in such cases, suspicion often falls on the partner. However, his alibi was solid. He had spent the entire day at work. Despite this, many continued to suspect that Shane might be involved in Heidi's disappearance. At that time, the case of Chris Watts, who killed his wife and 2 daughters, was actively discussed, and people couldn't help but compare the events. Shane gave interviews and his behavior seemed insincere to people, casting doubt on his words. As a result, he was harassed on social media. Shane recounted that he last spoke to Heidi on the phone around 8:30 a.m. She informed him that she had dropped off their son at school, then visited a book fair with their daughter and bought a few books she planned to read. She also bought children's books for sailors. Heidi loved books and was building her own library at home. After that, they said goodbye and Shane returned to work. He received no further messages from her. Detectives began thoroughly examining the house and the surrounding area. It turned out that Heidi's car was in the garage. Shane confirmed that she only used her car and did not take taxis. This meant she had to be somewhere nearby. The woman and her baby were declared missing, and the search spread throughout the county. While examining the area around the house, investigators found surveillance cameras at a neighboring house and requested the footage. They began analyzing the footage and interviewing neighbors. The video showed Heidi leaving with the children for school at 7:30 a.m. After that, she returned home with her daughter. Later, Heidi and the baby left the house and got into a silver car. The quality of the footage was insufficient to recognize the license plate or even the make and model of the car. This was the last time Heidi was seen alive. One of the neighbors shared testimony that in the morning she saw Heidi in their residential complex. She was carrying the baby and approaching a car parked nearby. Another woman came out of the car to meet her, greeted her, and both, taking the baby, got into the car and drove away. It seemed that Heidi left with the baby in the company of an unknown person. The police decided to identify this woman. The missing woman's partner, Shane, indicated that the silver car Heidi got into looked like her friend Majin's car. He was convinced that Heidi wouldn't get into a car with an almost unfamiliar person. Interestingly, Majin had a key to their house for emergencies. When detectives contacted Majin, she denied any involvement in Heidi's disappearance. She claimed they had not seen each other on the day of the disappearance and added that maybe Shane could be involved. Majin said that Heidi had repeatedly complained about Shane's aggressive behavior, including physical violence. According to her, Shane often drank alcohol and could hit Heidi. She tried to leave him, but after finding out about her second pregnancy, she decided to stay and give him another chance. Shane proposed to her, and they were preparing for the wedding, but later, perhaps, Shane returned to his old habits. Majin showed the police pictures of Heidi with bruises as proof. However, after a detailed examination, it became clear that one of the bruises could have been from enrollment 4, and the other a household injury that did not indicate domestic violence. The police could not find confirmation of Majin's words about Shane's abuse. Shane categorically denied the accusations, insisting that he and Heidi loved each other and were planning a wedding, and there was no place for violence in their relationship. During the investigation, the police found other surveillance cameras nearby and gathered new recordings of better quality. Detectives managed to identify the car in the recordings and concluded that it was indeed Majin's car, which Shane recognized. This indicated that Majin, despite her denials, did meet with Heidi that day. She became the main suspect in the kidnapping of Heidi and her child. Surveillance of Majin's house led to new discoveries. Observing her boyfriend Christopher showed that he went to the store to buy baby formula. When approached by detectives, they showed him a photo of little Margot in Heidi's arms. Christopher recognized the girl and confirmed that Majin presented this child as her own, and she was staying with her at home. This removed all doubts about Majin's involvement in Heidi's disappearance. The police obtained a search warrant and again went to Majin's house in Houston, where they knocked on the door. She came out of the house, holding a baby monitor in her hands. The woman looked visibly worried. In the nursery, a girl was peacefully sleeping in the crib. Majin claimed this was her child and that she was not involved in Heidi and her daughter's disappearance. However, no one believed her words. Shane recognized his daughter by her face and clothes. Child Protective Services took the baby and temporarily placed her in foster care. The police thoroughly searched the house for evidence. Inside, they found nothing suspicious, but when they went outside, they saw Majin's silver car, the same one Heidi had left with her. Approaching closer, detectives smelled a strong odor of decomposition, which they knew well. Opening the trunk, they found Heidi's body packed in a large sports bag. The body was in a state of decomposition. Majin was immediately arrested. DNA testing confirmed the police's suspicions. The girl found in Majin's house was Heidi and Shane's daughter. The girl was returned to her father, who was now left with 2 children on the eve of the holidays. The family was preparing for Christmas, wrapping gifts, but now their plans were ruined.
They would no longer be able to celebrate Christmas together. Shane could not believe for a long time that Machen, who had been Heidi's best friend and with whom they had been friends for over 20 years, could commit such a terrible crime. They had very close, trusting relationships, never quarreled, and no one could predict such a thing. After Heidi's disappearance, Machen called Shane every day to find out how the investigation was progressing. Shane even thought that Machen was too obsessed with Heidi and wanted to be with her every minute. She was jealous and offended when Heidi spent time with her husband and children without her. The investigation showed that after Heidi's disappearance, Machen actively followed her search and the investigation's progress. On her phone and computer, Machen constantly searched for information about the Amber Alert and the investigation. She entered Heidi Browsard's name into the search engine 162 times. The autopsy showed that Heidi was strangled with hands and ligature. The case was reclassified as murder, and the investigation continued. Machen told investigators that she gave birth at a birthing center in the Woodlands, north of Houston, on December 10, a few days before Heidi's disappearance, and brought the baby home that same day. However, during questioning, she could not recall the center's name to confirm her words. The police contacted all birthing centers in the state, but no one had a record of a woman named Machen Fieramusca. It turned out she had never sought medical care and was not registered during her pregnancy, deceiving her boyfriend by claiming to visit the doctor weekly. The police traced the movements of Heidi's and Machen's phones and found that they traveled together from Buda to Machen's house in Houston, where Heidi's body was later found in the car. As it turned out, Machen's car with Heidi's body stood outside her boyfriend's house for a whole week. Machen used the car despite the unbearable smell of the decomposing body. It is curious how Christopher, Machen's boyfriend, did not notice this smell. He was called for questioning. Christopher told investigators that he and Machen had been together for about 2 years. But in March 2019, he decided to break up with her because he was tired of the relationship. He asked her to move out, but she was categorically against it and asked to stay in another room, as she had nowhere else to go. He felt sorry for her and allowed her to stay. They lived in different rooms in his house and hardly communicated. He couldn't evict her, and when he found out about her pregnancy, he decided to try to start over. Christopher only touched Machen's stomach a few times during her pregnancy, but didn't realize it was fake. Christopher also admitted that due to strained relations, he never saw her stomach without clothes, but noticed that it was growing and never suspected it was a deception. Every time Machen scheduled a doctor's appointment, Christopher was out of town, and she didn't invite him, but he didn't really want to go with her to the doctor. Christopher was also out of town during the birth. Machen told him she gave birth to a daughter on the beach during a walk when he returned home and saw her with the baby in her arms. According to her, the birth went well, and she didn't seek medical help. Machen's family communicated with her via video calls and claimed she looked happy with the baby. Her relatives visited Machen a few days before the birth and confirmed she looked pregnant. They did not doubt her pregnancy because she wore tight clothes and had a large belly. In reality, she staged the pregnancy and deceived everyone, including her boyfriend Christopher Green, who believed she was due to give birth on December 1. This was a 9-month sinister plan devised by Machen to kidnap Heidi's baby even before her birth. Machen wanted to win back her boyfriend Christopher. Upon learning of the deception, Christopher broke up with her and temporarily moved in with his mother due to harassment by journalists. Christopher was not charged as the police believed he was unaware of Machen's plans. He was only a witness in the case. Machen Fieramusca grew up in a large family with 9 siblings. The youngest brother was only 9 years old. She always dreamed of having many children and a large family, but could not get pregnant. Her relationship with her boyfriend did not work out, and desperation led to the birth of a terrible plan when she learned about her close friend's pregnancy. Machen envied Heidi and dreamed of having a baby. She decided that her friend's child would solve all her problems. She lured Heidi and the baby into her car and drove them far from home. There she attacked Heidi and strangled her. Then she put the body in the trunk and returned home with the baby. The police found that Machen was extremely knowledgeable about all aspects of the investigation. She constantly checked the news on her phone and computer, searching for information about the investigation, using Heidi Browsard's name 162 times. This indicated her strong interest in the progress of the search. She actively followed the situation to know what was happening. Christopher also noted that Machen had a complicated history with her relationships. She had problems with many guys and often deceived them. He admitted that at the beginning of their relationship,
Machen
Seemed
seemed
like the perfect girlfriend to him, but over time he began to notice her lies and manipulations. He was shocked at how far she was willing to go to achieve her goals. Investigators also found that Machen constantly visited various forums and groups on social media, where the topic of pregnancy and child rearing was discussed. She used this knowledge to create the illusion of her pregnancy. Machen carefully prepared for her role, studying all aspects of pregnancy and childbirth to avoid arousing suspicion in others. The investigation showed that Machen acted very cautiously and thoughtfully. She had a detailed plan and followed it to avoid exposure. Her deception was so convincing that even the closest people did not suspect her true intentions. When the search for Heidi began, Machen tried to appear extremely upset by her best friend's disappearance. She even called local TV channels to draw public attention to the case. This successfully diverted suspicion from her. Machen was charged with kidnapping Heidi and her child and murder, for which she faced the death penalty. It turned out that Machen had a previous criminal record for theft. She meticulously planned the entire operation, faking her pregnancy for several months to present Heidi's newborn child as her own. The prosecution argued that she intended not only to kidnap the child, but also to kill Heidi. Machen knew that Heidi would not voluntarily give up her child and was ready to take extreme measures. According to one of their mutual friends, Heidi's second pregnancy was unplanned, and their financial situation was unstable. Heidi considered an abortion, but Machen insisted she keep the child and even offered to take the baby herself. No one took these words seriously, but perhaps that was when Machen's plan formed. Later, Heidi decided to keep the baby. Her fiancé, Shane, was devastated by the loss and did not know how to live on with 2 children. He suspected that Machen had an accomplice since Heidi was stronger than Machen, and she couldn't handle her alone. Heidi's family also suspected that Machen had a helper, but they didn't think it was her boyfriend because he wanted to break up with her, and she was holding him with the baby lie. A witness claimed to have seen someone else in the car with Machen and Heidi, but did not recognize the face. Machen was sitting in the front seat, Heidi in the back, and an unknown person was driving. This information was not confirmed. Shane recounted that Machen told him and Heidi that she had given birth to a girl on December 8, but she didn't show the baby to anyone. She didn't even post photos on social media, justifying it by saying she had a dream in which someone kidnapped her baby. This scared her so much that she decided not to show the baby to anyone. Before Heidi's disappearance, she expressed her dissatisfaction that Machen had not invited her to the birth, even though she had attended both of Heidi's births. This offended Heidi, but Machen justified it with superstitions and not wanting to share the moment with others. Shane, analyzing the past, recalled another oddity. During Heidi's discharge from the hospital, Machen, who was supposedly 37 weeks pregnant, couldn't stay away from the baby and constantly asked to hold her. She already had a strange interest in the child then, but no one paid attention to it. It is also unclear why she left Heidi's body in the trunk of her car instead of disposing of it. At the trial, Machen continued to claim that the child was hers. A psychiatric evaluation revealed she had bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, but she was still deemed sane and capable of standing trial. The evidence was overwhelmingly against her, and it was clear she had planned and meticulously prepared for the murder. Under her lawyer's influence, Machen Fieramusca struck a plea deal, admitting guilt to receive a lighter sentence and avoid the death penalty. She waived her right to appeal. Heidi's relatives agreed to the deal to avoid endless appeals. Machen was sentenced to 55 years in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, the judge said, "It is impossible to find justice for this horrific crime. You deprived an innocent child of the opportunity to grow up with her mother. You destroyed an entire family. No matter how long and harsh the sentence is, nothing can change now." This story also underscores the importance of trust and openness in relationships. Shane and Heidi had been close friends with Machen for many years, but no one suspected her true intentions. This reminds us that even the closest people can have hidden motives, and it is essential to be attentive to changes in the behavior and moods of loved ones. Another important moral of this story is that lies and manipulations can have far-reaching consequences. Machen pretended to be pregnant for many months, and this lie led to the destruction of several lives. She not only destroyed Heidi's family, but also caused immense pain and suffering to her own loved ones. Lies tend to accumulate and eventually lead to catastrophe. The story also emphasizes the importance of justice and the rule of law. Despite all of Machen's efforts to avoid punishment, she was exposed and convicted of the crime she committed. This shows that even the most carefully planned crimes do not go unpunished, and sooner or later, justice prevails. Additionally, the story of Heidi and Machen highlights the importance of support and love in the family. Shane, who was left with 2 children after losing Heidi, had to find the strength to continue living and raising his children. His resilience and dedication to his family serve as an example for all of us. This tragic case underscores how important it is to support our loved ones in difficult times and never give up, even when life seems to be falling apart. Finally, this story reminds us of the value of life and the fragility of human relationships. Every day we must cherish what we have and remember that our actions can profoundly impact others. Jaden Parkinson was a girl who radiated joy and a love for life. Her slightly mischievous nature harmoniously combined with her natural charm. From her early years, there was a special bond between Jaden and her mother, filled with love and trust. The girl's openness and friendliness helped her find many friends at school. Everyone who knew Jaden noted her sensitivity, cheerful disposition, and kind heart. Studies came easily to her, and her dream of becoming a hairdresser inspired her to move forward. But at the age of 7, Jaden's life underwent a dramatic change. Her parents decided to divorce. Custody of the girl, as well as her brother and sisters, was unexpectedly awarded to her father by the court. Together with the children, he moved to Oxford in the United Kingdom. This move was a real shock for the Parkinson family, especially for the children who were used to the atmosphere of love created by both parents. They missed the fun holidays and pleasant surprises that Mom and Dad would arrange to please them. It remained a mystery how the father managed to get custody of the children. It was clear to everyone that this decision was a real blow to both the children and their mother. It hit Jaden especially hard, as she had an extremely close relationship with her mom. Family friends claimed there were no obvious conflicts or negativity between the couple. However, despite all efforts, the mother failed to defend her right to stay with the children. The teenage years brought new trials for Jaden. Her irrepressible energy and awakened rebellious spirit complicated her father's attempts to cope with his daughter's upbringing. Despite the fact that the girl retained her kindness, charm, and wonderful sense of humor, she faced typical problems of the transitional age, especially after moving to high school. Relations with her father became increasingly strained, despite his sincere attempts to surround the children with care and provide them with everything they needed. Nevertheless, he was stricter and more demanding compared to their mother. At this age, Jaden perceived her father's care as a restriction of freedom and a manifestation of excessive control. The situation was aggravated by the lack of regular communication with her mother, whom the girl missed terribly. All this led to constant conflicts and misunderstandings. In search of understanding and support, Jaden began to run away from home. This problem, unfortunately, is quite common among teenagers. But it is worth noting that the girl did not wander the streets or questionable companies. Instead, she would immediately go to her mother to spend time in the comfort of her home. At the same time, Jaden did not stop communicating with her father, answered his calls, but at the first opportunity, tried to return to her mother, because it was with her that she felt truly loved and understood. Despite all the trials, that special bond between mother and daughter remained. It seemed that the difficulties of adolescence only strengthened their relationship. During one of these visits to her mother, 14-year-old Jaden met a guy named Jake Blakely, and through him, his older brother Ben. At that time, Ben was already 20 years old. Despite the significant age difference, a mutual attraction arose between Jaden and Ben, and they decided to try to build a relationship. This decision caused an ambiguous reaction in those around them. Some believed that such a choice of partner indicated the emotional immaturity of the young man. However, Jaden herself seemed very attracted to the idea of dating an older guy. Of course, due to her age, she still remained naive and could not always cope with her emotions and feelings. But despite all the warnings, a romantic relationship full of hopes and expectations for a happy future began between these two young people. Jaden dreamed of a happy future, not realizing that her fate was already in the hands of a real monster. From the moment Ben became Jaden's boyfriend, he began to actively integrate into her environment, striking up acquaintances with his girlfriend's classmates. Despite the obvious difference in life experience and views, he managed to find a common language with the school children, and even to some extent become a leader for them. In parallel with this, Ben began to surround Jaden with excessive attention and care, which made the girl fall head over heels in love with him. It seemed that he completely captured her thoughts and feelings. Ben would tell her about a bright future together, painted vivid pictures of their life, built castles in the air. The naive young Jaden believed that it was with him that she would be able to achieve the happiness that her parents had once failed to achieve. But the period of romance and carefree life did not last long. Later, Ben's behavior began to take on more and more possessive and manipulative features. Insults and humiliation began. Just a month after the start of their relationship, he first allowed himself to treat Jaden really rudely. The girl, who found herself in a relationship with a guy for the first time, and much older than her, began to look for the reasons for such a change in herself, in her possible shortcomings. Ben masterfully exploited her insecurity, noticing that Jaden was succumbing to his influence. The girl's naivety allowed him to find fault with any little things in her behavior or words. He arranged real emotional swings for her. At one moment he could say how charming and beautiful she was, and the next moment accuse her of terrible things. Especially often jealousy became a reason for accusations. Ben would come up with a variety of reasons to accuse Jaden of betrayal and deception. It was during this period that the girl found out that her boyfriend was periodically using illegal substances. His emotional instability and mood swings were partly explained by this fact. But all signs indicated that verbal abuse would not be limited to this. When Jaden was already firmly attached to this toxic relationship, Ben's behavior became truly aggressive and cruel. Once, when they were walking with the girl's group of friends, he began to openly express his dissatisfaction with them. This was a typical manipulator tactic, trying to isolate his victim from a close environment, to isolate her from friends. Unfortunately, Jaden did not realize what was happening at that time. Each claim or reproach from Ben made her feel guilty. She really began to believe that it was her behavior that was the cause of all misunderstandings and conflicts. It was then that Jaden first dared to stand up to her boyfriend. She defended her right to communicate with friends, which caused Ben's furious anger. He resorted to a variety of manipulative techniques to make the girl quarrel with her friends. Jaden tried with all her might to maintain these friendly relations. But gradually, everyone began to turn away from her because of the toxic behavior of her boyfriend. Despite everything, feelings for Ben did not fade, although his behavior was becoming more and more outrageous. Once he even allowed himself to hit Jaden in the face. And although it was obvious that such behavior could not be justified, Ben managed to convince the girl that she was to blame herself and deserved it. Jaden's family saw that their daughter and sister was in a toxic relationship with a very dangerous person. Her mother and father were worried about her, tried to get through, but the girl found herself in a state of constant break between family and her beloved. Infatuation clouded her mind, and again she chose Ben. Gradually, his behavior became more and more inadequate and unpredictable. So, after one of the quarrels with Jaden, he caught a neighbor's cat and brutally killed it by cutting off its head. With this act, Ben wanted to take revenge on the girl, so he threw the head of the innocent animal into her bed. Jaden was shocked and horrified by this turn of events. But even after that, Ben managed to confuse her and make her doubt the reality of what happened. Ben masterfully played the role of a lover, but behind his charming smile hid the soul of a real sadist. Ben did not stop at threats to deal with Jaden's pet. He went even further, stating that he could just as easily take the life of the girl herself and her entire family. Young Parkinson, due to her small life experience, simply could not see signs of a serious mental disorder in such behavior. And Ben, meanwhile, continued to masterfully manipulate the inexperienced teenage girl. To prove the seriousness of his intentions, once, when Jaden again tried to get out of his total control, the young man brutally dealt with her own cat. The most terrible thing was that at that moment, the animal was pregnant. This horrific event became the last straw for Jaden. She finally became convinced that her chosen one was an extremely dangerous person. But the girl was completely at a loss. She simply did not know how to solve this problem and end the relationship without catastrophic consequences. Ben kept her close to him, using all possible methods of influence. Now threats were added to his arsenal, which became a powerful lever of pressure on the teenager's psyche. In fact, at that time, Ben had long been in the field of view of law enforcement officers. The guy's life was quite difficult and full of criminal adventures. For a long time, he was engaged in petty crimes, for which he repeatedly got into the police station. Ben was brought up in a foster family, where he had extremely tense relations with his parents. The man who replaced his own father suffered from alcoholism, and more than once subjected the boy to brutal violence in childhood. Ben grew up in an atmosphere of constant fear, endless humiliation and beatings, which undoubtedly left its mark on his fragile child's psyche. Ben's relatives also very quickly realized that their boy was a considerable danger to those around him. So once, when his mother began to express her dissatisfaction with his behavior, because of which he again got into trouble with the law, Ben suddenly exploded in anger. In a fit of mad rage, the young man grabbed a screwdriver and began to threaten his own mother with physical violence. The woman was shocked and frightened by the realization that a juvenile maniac was living in her house. But despite this, she still decided not to write a statement to the police for the time being, but to try to help her son cope with his problems on her own. As a result, instead of prison, the boy ended up at a psychiatric clinic, where a rather revealing conversation took place with one of the doctors. It is worth noting that at the time of that visit, Ben was still in school. However, instead of topics typical for his age, the young man began to talk with the medic about how to commit the perfect murder, then get rid of the body, and at the same time remain unpunished. It's even scary to imagine that the boy was barely 13 at the time. The words of the young patient greatly interested the psychiatrist. He began to question Ben, trying to understand the way he thinks. The doctor hoped that such frankness would help to better understand the boy's diagnosis. But Ben, it seemed, was only too happy to share his ideas. He willingly told that, in his opinion, the best place to hide a body is a freshly dug grave. Like, bury the dead man imperceptibly for yourself and live in peace. There, for sure, no one will guess to look. When Jaden's parents learned about all these alarming facts, they firmly decided to put an end to their daughter's relationship with this dangerous scumbag, who already had the cold-blooded murder of pets on his account. At that time, Ben was already practically openly mocking the defenseless girl. It was clear to the naked eye that Jaden was in an extremely depressed emotional state. Every time she was left alone, the schoolgirl would cry bitterly. She felt helpless, driven into a corner. She saw no way out of this unhealthy relationship and fervently wished that her tormentor would just disappear from her life forever. In turn, Ben tried to isolate Jaden even from her own family, seeking to completely control absolutely all areas of the young lover's life. When verbal methods of influence did not work, he did not hesitate to resort to outright physical violence. Jaden found herself trapped by a masterful manipulator, feeling completely helpless, but continued to obey his will. The situation only worsened with each passing day. Under pressure from Ben, the girl began to steal things from her own home. The guy, who did not have a permanent job and could not earn money on his own, forced his girlfriend to commit a crime. He convinced Jaden to secretly take various things out of the house, sell them, and give him all the proceeds. Using manipulation and threats, Ben forced Jaden to constantly lie to her relatives. When the family finally noticed the disappearance of many things and exposed the girl, a serious conflict broke out in the house. Relations with loved ones deteriorated significantly, but Jaden did not dare to tell the real reason for her behavior, because she was afraid of Ben's anger. Eventually, the situation escalated to the point that the girl decided to run away from her father's house. Unfortunately, the only place she could move to was her boyfriend's house. At that time, Ben was living with his cousin, but just a few weeks after Jaden moved in, the cousin moved out. Later, the girl recalled with what incredible cruelty Ben treated her during that period. Beatings became a kind of daily ritual for him. At a certain time, he would take Jaden to the bathroom, brutally beat her, and then lock her up there for several hours. The 16-year-old girl found herself in a hopeless situation and simply did not know what to do next. She did not dare to return home because her relatives had caught her stealing. In addition, Ben threatened that if she left him, he would destroy her entire family. From now on, Ben controlled literally every step of his girl. He constantly humiliated her, inflicted physical pain, even pulled out her hair, which dealt a crushing blow to Jaden's self-esteem. The guy was jealous of her of every passerby, cruelly punishing her even for an accidental glance in the direction of another person. At the same time, he himself repeatedly cheated on Jaden, even had a relationship with his brother's girl, which clearly indicates the extremely low moral qualities of this person. Despite the constant manifestations of cruelty, Jayden continued to maintain this toxic relationship. She lived in constant fear that Ben would really carry out his threats and brutally deal with her entire family. Meanwhile, his control over the girl only intensified. It got to the point that when he woke up in the morning, Ben would first lock Jayden in the room and only then go about his business or have fun. For any action, even the smallest, the girl had to get his permission. Of course, under such conditions she could not study normally. Her whole life was being destroyed before her eyes, but a blind feeling for the manipulator and all-consuming fear clouded her mind, not allowing her to adequately assess reality. Each new day brought Jayden new suffering, but the most terrible test was yet to come. Beatings became an integral part of Jayden's life. They occurred with horrifying regularity. Ben did not shy away from any methods of violence. He strangled the girl, dealt blows with his fists, bit, threw her to the floor, and brutally pushed her with his feet. 2 years had passed since the beginning of this toxic relationship, and Jayden's life had turned into a real hell. But suddenly, a ray of hope appeared in this darkness. Jayden's mother, realizing the full seriousness of the situation, decided to take her daughter to herself at all costs. She made every effort to calm the girl down and force her to completely sever all ties with the abuser. But Jayden, who always showed a rebellious character in communicating with her relatives, perceived her mother's persuasion extremely hostilely. Just a few days passed, and she returned to her tormentor again. The girl became so emotionally dependent on this monster that even under the threat of reprisals against her family, she did not dare to leave him, although deep down she desperately wanted to. Of course, no positive changes occurred. The moral and physical violence only gained momentum. And finally, in November 2013, Jayden took a desperate step to break this destructive relationship once and for all. However, fear for the safety of loved ones did not allow her to return home. Instead, the girl decided to hide in a homeless shelter. Undoubtedly, this is not the best choice for a minor, but Jayden sincerely believed that the staff of the institution would be able to provide her with the necessary help and protection, and most importantly, her ex-boyfriend would not be able to find her there. Unfortunately, these hopes turned out to be in vain. Ben tracked down Jayden pretty quickly. He regularly visited the shelter, continuing to impose his will on the girl. It came to the point of absurdity. Ben even forbade her to visit the toilet. At first, Jayden obeyed this humiliating order, but later she dared to violate it. In the shelter, the girl had the opportunity to communicate with the staff. Experienced employees opened her eyes to the fact that she was in an extremely dangerous and destructive dependence on an abuser guy, a masterful manipulator. They convinced Jayden that such a toxic environment created by Ben could not be considered normal under any circumstances. Gradually, the girl came to the realization that she was not obliged to follow all the orders and whims of her ex to obey his cruel rules. For the first time in a long time, Jayden had a real opportunity to correct the mistakes of the past. Hope for a happy future settled in her heart again. But at the same time, Ben began to notice that his ex-girlfriend was gradually getting out of control. This ignited a furious anger and thirst for revenge in him. The last straw was the realization that Jayden had found herself a new boyfriend. Without wasting time, Ben began to send her threats, trying to restore his control and return the girl to the usual framework of a toxic relationship. He even managed to gradually scare away Jayden's new chosen one, who, frightened by the seriousness of the threats, decided not to take risks and not mess with a dangerous rival. But Ben was not going to stop there. He decided to deal a crushing blow to the reputation of his former girlfriend by publishing her intimate photos and videos on the internet, which he took without the girl's consent throughout the entire period of their relationship. It turned out that he had accumulated a whole collection of such materials. Ben's true goal was to drive Jayden to despair and push her to commit suicide. Unfortunately, at that time, the legislation did not provide for any responsibility for the publication of other people's intimate materials. Only from 2015, such actions began to qualify as crimes on sexual grounds, for which a punishment of 2 years in prison was provided. So in 2013, when the described events took place, Ben actually remained out of reach for justice. Even nowadays, it is quite difficult to prove guilt in such cases, and in the complete absence of a legislative framework, it seemed completely impossible. Jayden could only watch helplessly as the offender destroyed her reputation, but the biggest shock was waiting for the girl ahead. Despite all the bullying, she did not succumb to despair and did not take her own life.
However, a few weeks after breaking up with Ben, Jaden found out about her pregnancy. The girl did not even think about getting rid of the child. On the contrary, she hoped that the appearance of a common baby would help resolve all conflicts, awaken the best feelings in Ben's heart, and return their relationship to a normal course. It seemed that motherhood could soften Ben's heart. But this illusion very quickly shattered to smithereens. Despite all the suffering and humiliation that Jaden had to endure, she could not forget about the problems in her own family caused by her parents' divorce. The girl sincerely believed that every child deserves the love and care of both parents. That is why on December 3rd, 2013, she dared to call Ben to inform him about her delicate situation and name him the father of the unborn baby. It is worth noting that for this conversation, Jaden had to use someone else's phone because Ben had taken her mobile from her and had not returned it. Upon hearing the news of the pregnancy, the guy refused to believe his ex-girlfriend. Jaden desperately tried to convince him that she had not been intimate with anyone else, so she could not get pregnant by someone else. But all her arguments ran into a wall of distrust. Ben stubbornly accused the girl of trying to lure him into a trap by imposing someone else's child on him. Ben's reaction seemed strange at the very least, because up to that point, he himself had been actively stalking his former lover. Probably the guy once again tried to make Jaden feel guilty and thus control her emotions and decisions. Be that as it may, as a result of this tense conversation, the young people agreed on a personal meeting in order to discuss everything in detail. The day before, Jaden met with her mother and told her about her pregnancy. The girl assured her mother that she finally felt free and happy because Ben allegedly left her alone. The woman was sincerely happy about her daughter's decision because she had long tried to convince her to break off this toxic relationship, realizing how dangerous Ben could be. That day, mother and daughter talked for a long time about Jaden's current life and her plans for the future. They even agreed to go to the store together in the near future to buy the necessary things for the unborn child. But by the irony of fate, Jaden never told her mother about the horrific details of her ex-boyfriend's behavior and a planned meeting with him. The fact is that the girl was afraid of Ben's reaction. She did not want to endanger her mother, knowing about his aggressive nature. Around 3:30 p.m., 17-year-old Jaden went to meet with Ben, full of hopes and expectations. This meeting was supposed to be decisive. The girl's future life and that of her unborn child depended on it. The former lovers met at Oxford Station, getting caught on CCTV cameras. Further, Ben and Jaden's path led to the countryside near Didcot. The trusting girl believed the guy's assurances that they were heading for a picturesque picnic, where they could talk frankly in an atmosphere of peace and unity with nature. Jaden was last seen alive at Didcot Station. This moment was also recorded by CCTV cameras. From the very beginning of this fatal meeting, Ben's behavior seemed arrogant and rude. He continued to accuse Jaden of lying about her pregnancy, rejecting any of the girl's attempts to prove her case. Eventually, the young people reached a remote field, which, in Ben's opinion, was supposed to be the ideal place for a frank conversation. In fact, the guy brought Jaden here for a completely different purpose. Carefully looking around and making sure that they were left alone, Ben led Jaden to an old abandoned barn. Suspecting nothing, the girl obediently went inside, not even suspecting her companion's true intentions. No one could believe what Ben was capable of. His act forever changed the course of this story. Once in the barn, Ben abruptly changed his behavior, filled with unrestrained aggression. He began to furiously accuse Jaden of betrayal, claiming that the pregnancy was an insidious result of her infidelity. The guy's rage rapidly increased, reaching its apogee in a matter of minutes. Finally, he pounced on the defenseless girl who had so recklessly trusted him. With several powerful blows, Ben knocked Jaden off her feet. She fell to the ground,
And at that moment, the enraged sadist pounced on her, grabbing her throat with his hands. He squeezed her neck with inhuman strength, while the poor girl desperately tried to break free from this deadly grip. But it was in vain. Jaden gradually lost strength, no longer showing signs of life. Finally releasing her exhausted body, Ben took out his mobile phone and, using the screen, checked whether his victim was still breathing. Making sure that the girl was dead, he finally calmed down. The goal was achieved. During the subsequent investigation, forensic experts were unable to reliably confirm that Jaden was indeed pregnant at the time of the murder. There remained a possibility that the pregnancy test could have been false, or the girl deliberately deceived Ben, hoping in this way to soften his attitude towards her and establish a relationship. Be that as it may, it was no longer possible for anyone to find out the truth. Now Ben faced the urgent need to get rid of the body. Finally, he found himself in a situation that he had long dreamed of in his perverted fantasies, to commit the perfect murder and get away with it. But in a fit of reprisal against Jaden, he did not think about the tools with which he could cover up the traces of the crime. Realizing that he did not even have a shovel at hand, Ben decided to return home for the necessary tools. The footage from the CCTV cameras at the railway station clearly shows how the killer returns alone from the fields and boards a train. Only a few days later, he again visited the crime scene, but this time not alone, but with his younger brother Jake. The boy had barely turned 17. He had an absolutely unblemished reputation. He had never been noticed in connections with the criminal world or any illegal actions. But despite this, the older brother without hesitation made Jake an involuntary accomplice in his terrible deed. It is quite likely that the boy simply did not dare to refuse Ben, even realizing the dubiousness of his request. Arriving at the place, Ben imperiously ordered Jake to dig a deep hole near the barn where the murder took place. The boy obediently followed the order, perhaps realizing that disobedience could cost him his health or even his life. When Jake asked about the purpose of the pit, Ben lied that he intended to hide a weapon there. Of course, this explanation did not sound as creepy as the need to hide the body of a murdered girl. However, despite his pretended gullibility, the younger brother almost immediately sensed something was wrong, and yet he decided to remain silent and continue to dig. The pit was ready, and Ben, hastily saying goodbye to his brother, threw Jaden's bloody body into it, and then quickly covered it with earth. But even with that, the eerie story did not end. In Ben's mind, darkened by painful fantasies, another perverse plan ripened. On December 9th, 6 days after the murder, he returned to the pit and dug up the already half-decomposed body of his ex-girlfriend. Ben brought an old grandmother's suitcase with him, in which he was going to pack the remains of the unfortunate Jaden. With disgusting negligence, he shoved the body into the suitcase, giving it an unnaturally hunched pose. After that, around 1 a.m, Ben stopped a taxi. The driver, seeing a strange young man with a huge suitcase standing on the side of the road in the middle of the night, all covered in mud and with disheveled hair, for some reason did not suspect anything wrong. He obediently drove the client to the nearest church, on the territory of which there was an old cemetery. As it turned out later, it was there that Ben had prepared a grave for his victim in advance. The most impressive fact was that the murderer's younger brother was involved in digging this grave. This time, Ben lied to Jake that he was going to bury some dead animal in the cemetery. The investigation suggested that the only reason for such tacit complicity of the boy in his brother's crimes was the incredible fear of taking the place of one of the victims. It's hard to believe, but Ben even made up a whole story to justify his actions with hiding the body. He claimed that he considered it unworthy to bury his ex-lover somewhere in a field, like some dead animal. Therefore, he allegedly decided to bury her in a human way, in a cemetery, in the grave of someone close. Meanwhile, Jaden's relatives were alarmed because the girl had disappeared without a trace. She did not answer calls, ignored all messages. The mother of the unfortunate girl tried to find her through friends, checked the shelter where she lived, but all attempts were in vain. Jaden's phone remained with Ben, who later simply sold the device, completely depriving the missing girl's relatives of the opportunity to contact her. On December 4th, 2013, the Parkinson family finally turned to the police with a statement about Jaden's disappearance. Law enforcement officers immediately began an investigation. They interviewed the girl's relatives and acquaintances, posted leaflets with her photographs, and involved volunteers in the search operation. About 100 police officers were involved in these searches. They combed the area, inspected the territory from the air, reviewed CCTV footage throughout the city. And at some point, the first alarming signs began to appear, which indicated the involvement of the girl's ex-boyfriend in her disappearance. As a result, all the evidence led the investigators to the doorstep of Ben's house. Based on the information gathered, the police accused the young man of kidnapping Jaden. However, from the very beginning, he began to deny that he had seen the girl on the day of her disappearance. Of course, the investigators did not believe a single word of his. because they had heard a lot of evidence about how Ben communicated and behaved with Jayden shortly before her disappearance, and the CCTV footage contradicted his words. Trying to convince the police of his non-involvement, Ben began to get angry, shout, and even allowed himself veiled threats against law enforcement officers. It seemed that the guy did not realize at all how serious the situation was and with whom he was talking. During interrogations, the suspect behaved extremely arrogantly and aggressively, which only increased the suspicions of detectives. They felt that Ben was clearly hiding something. During interrogations, the young man tried to convince the investigation that he had parted with Jayden long ago, that she no longer interested him, and therefore he had no idea where she could be. But since the girl had disappeared more than a week ago, the police began to consider the worst-case scenario. Jayden was no longer alive. The progress of the investigation was actively covered in the media, which eventually bore fruit. A taxi driver who had given Ben a ride with a huge suitcase to the church cemetery that fateful night contacted the police. The man recognized the main suspect and wanted to share his memories of those events. Having received this information, the investigators, together with the dog handlers, went to inspect the place indicated by the taxi driver. Soon, in an old barn near the church, a suitcase was found that exactly matched the description of the one that Ben was carrying in a taxi. In parallel, there was a shift in the conversation with the suspect's brother. Jake admitted that his older brother had twice forced him to dig holes in suspicious places, although he did not explain what for. All these facts made it possible on December 19th, on the eve of Christmas, to find the body of the missing girl. This day forever darkened the life of the Parkinson family. The autopsy of Jayden's body, conducted by a forensic expert, showed that the cause of the girl's death was strangulation. On her face and head, relatively large bruises were found, the nature of which indicated strong blows with a fist or foot. The official identification of the deceased was carried out by her mother, who was forced to experience the worst thing that can happen to parents, to bury her own child. While awaiting court hearings, Ben was in custody. It was during this period that he wrote a confession to the crime he had committed. However, the main line of his defense was the statement that he could not be held responsible for the murder because of his alleged mental illness. Obviously, in this way, the suspect hoped to avoid punishment. Psychiatric examinations were appointed, which refuted his statements. According to experts, at the time of the murder, the young man was fully aware of his actions. Ben was charged not only with premeditated murder, but also with desecrating the body of the deceased. His lawyer insisted that the defendant had no criminal intent when he went with his ex-girlfriend to a remote countryside. They allegedly just planned to talk. Also, the defense denied the facts of Ben's cruel treatment of Jayden. However, during the investigation, many witnesses were found who revealed the full depth of the accused's cruelty towards the deceased. About 10 people from Jayden's circle confirmed that they had repeatedly seen traces of beatings on the girl's body, noticed striking changes in her behavior under the influence of Ben's psychological manipulations. But the most chilling details were revealed in their conclusions by forensic experts. Experts were convinced that the accused strangled his victim at least 3 times, each time bringing her to her senses. Obviously, he did it for the sake of perverted pleasure. Throughout the trial, the defendant showed no signs of remorse. He could suddenly laugh, make an inappropriate joke, and then suddenly get angry and start insulting everyone present. Once Ben even threatened the prosecutor with physical violence. Of course, such behavior only worsened his position and convinced the jury of the absolute inadequacy of the accused. After the court hearings were over, the jurors gathered for a meeting to make a verdict. The discussion lasted about 20 hours. As a result, 11 out of 12 members of the panel found Ben guilty of premeditated murder. When the judge was about to announce the verdict, the convicted man threw a real tantrum. He screamed, writhed in convulsions, and accused Jayden of conspiring against him. Despite all this, Ben believed that he deserved the death penalty. He said that he sees the murdered girl in his dreams. But since 2003, in the United Kingdom, the highest measure of punishment is life imprisonment. The judge emphasized that the convicted person poses a considerable danger to society. Ben was sentenced to the maximum penalty, life imprisonment with the right to review the sentence no earlier than after 20 years. After the end of the process over Jayden's killer, problems began with his younger brother. Jake tried for a long time to prove that he did not directly participate in the murder,
and helped to get rid of the body against his will. Eventually, he managed to convince the jury that he had become a victim of psychological pressure from his older brother and had been in fear the whole time.
He was afraid that Ben would throw him into one of those pits. Jaden Parkinson's relatives expressed the hope that her killer will never be released because he is an extremely dangerous person. The girl's mother is convinced that the problem of domestic violence should be discussed from school so that young girls are aware of and beware of any manifestations of abuse in relationships. Do not get involved with guys who are prone to manipulation and aggression.